We're back again for the final lecture of the semester in the Politics of Evolution. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about how we might choose between endorsing evolutionary biology or endorsing intelligent design. Now, my bias is obvious. It's been obvious for a long time. But once again, when you write your essays, you will not be penalized for disagreeing with me, and you will not be rewarded for agreeing with me. This is just a way that I find is useful for choosing between these two ways of thinking about the history of life. Somebody else, somebody who already is in favor of intelligent design, or even more, somebody who is a young Earth creationist, would say that I'm doing it wrong. There's a much better way to get at truth. This is my way. What I'm going to do is talk about scientific method. Remember, we talked about scientific method quite a bit at the beginning of the semester. And we talked about some of the problems and how you proceed and how there isn't one scientific method, but there are several scientific methods, a lot of that kind of stuff. But basically, this is the way you do it. You make observations and you devise a theory to explain the observations and possibly much more. That's called induction. Now in this case, Darwin and Mendel and Gould and Dawkins and 100 other people have already done the induction work for us. They've already created the theory of evolutionary biology. What we're going to do now is essentially test whether that theory is really any good, whether it explains things. And we do that with deduction. What we do with deduction is we ask, if you recall from earlier in the semester, you ask, if my theory is true, what else must be true? And you decide what must be true if your theory is true, and then you go see if that other thing is true. That's called deriving a hypothesis, a testable hypothesis, from your theory. And over time, if you derive a lot of testable hypotheses from your theory, and the theory survives the tests, then we say that it is provisionally true. That is, for now, for as nearly as we can tell, this theory is true. If the theory fails the tests, then you may want to fiddle with the theory, change it a little, or you may want to drop it and go to a new theory. If you cannot derive any testable hypotheses from your theory, then your theory has a big problem from the beginning, and you might want to think of jettisoning it and going to another theory. So, in paleontology, which is where this all kind of started, you can't derive a testable theory about something that's going to happen in the past. You can't say, I predict that elephants will evolve in this direction. I mean, that's not going to work. In the first place, you don't know how elephants are going to evolve because you don't know what their environmental conditions are going to be like. And secondly, you're not going to live long enough to see if your prediction works. What they have done in paleontology for these many decades now is they've done something which we call retrodiction. That is, they make a prediction about something about the past that you would find if you went and looked in evidence about the past. So, retrodiction is a prediction about the past And in the case of paleontology, you would say, I predict that if we looked at such and such a fossil, we would find such and such about that fossil, something that happened hundreds of millions of years ago, perhaps. And it's really cool to predict something that you might find that's several hundred million years old that confirms or falsifies your prediction. But that's the way we often work. But we can also use evolutionary theory to predict things about the future or predict things about the present. What we would find about processes in the present that are ongoing that are not really they don't really have anything to do with fossils or creatures in the past. If we can come up with testable predictions like that, that's good also. So, let's remember that if possible, we want to make predicted tests that can be replicated. That is, we'll do it again some other time. And we can argue, and philosophers of science do argue about exactly what is a replication. If you find this particular fossil, does that replicate your finding about that particular fossil that you found 100 years ago? On and on. We don't have to talk about that. What we have to remember is, what we're going to say is, here's our theory. If our theory is true, what else must be true? Let's go see if that other thing is true. So, let's talk about some examples in the history of biology in which this kind of testing was carried out. First, let's talk about Darwin. Darwin wrote an entire book about orchids. The book came out 1862. It was called The Fertilization of Orchids. And what his argument in this book about orchids, by the way are flowers, his argument about the fertilization of orchids was, and this was very daring in 1862. When I say this to you, you may not think it's any big deal. But in the 19th century, it was a very big deal. Darwin said, flowers co-evolve with the creatures that pollinate them. Orchids co-evolve with insects. And so over millions of years, orchids have evolved so that insects can pollinate them while they're looking for whatever the insects want inside the flower. And the insects themselves have evolved. And this process has been going on for so long that certain individual species of insects pollinate certain individual species of orchids. And these various partnerships between insect and flower have been evolving together for many millions of years. This was astonishing as a prediction in 1862. Darwin, in fact, made some individual predictions in that book. And in it he said, there's a certain kind of orchid that grows in Madagascar. Madagascar is a big island off the southeastern corner of the continent of Africa. I have the Latin name of the flower written down in my lecture notes. There's a certain kind of orchid that has a very long neck. That in order for the moth or wasp or whatever it is to get at the nectar that's way back in the bottom of this particular orchid, it has to have a very long tongue, or as I say, proboscis. It has to be almost 11 inches long. So Darwin, and at this time, 1862, no animal had been discovered that could hover and had a tongue like that in Madagascar. Darwin predicted that some moth would be discovered that had a tongue 11 inches long and pollinated this particular species of, what's the word I'm looking for? Orchid. He made this prediction, and as I say, in 1862, this was a shocking thing to say, that we're going to find this really weird moth that has a tongue 11 inches long. And I know that it has a tongue 11 inches long because this flower must have evolved with an insect that had a tongue that long. Well, Darwin died in 1882, and in 1903, they discovered the Madagascar hawk moth, which is a moth with a tongue 11 inches long that pollinates this particular orchid. So Darwin says, my theory is true, this must be true. Try and go find out if this other thing is true. Took them a long time, took them more than 40 years, but eventually they discovered that in fact it was true. Second example, there's a biologist at Stanford University named David Resnick. He studies guppies. I don't know if you ever had guppies as pets when you were a child, or you have these fish tanks, and guppies are little fish. When I was a kid, practically everybody had pet guppies. I don't know why. I'm sorry, he wasn't a Stanford. He was a professor of biology at UC Riverside. He studied animal behavior. That is, he's a social biologist. His particular subfield is the testing of a subtheory that derives from the theory of natural selection, and that is life history theory. I'm reading from his book. According to this theory, natural selection can do seemingly counterintuitive things. It can favor the evolution of a shorter lifespan or the production of fewer young, providing there are appropriate trade-offs at other stages of the life history. So to test his theory, he studied guppies, these little fish, not in aquariums, but they were living in freshwater streams on the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean Sea. Here's what he says. Guppies that live in the lower reaches of the streams with many predators should suffer higher mortality rates than guppies that live in the headwater streams where most predators are absent. If this is true, then life history theory predicts that in sections of the streams with predators, natural selection will favor those individuals that attain maturity at an earlier age and devote a bigger slice of their pie to making babies. Still quoting Resnick. Comparisons of populations from these two types of localities showed that guppies in nature do indeed differ from one another as the theory predicts. The guppies from localities with high predation were smaller and presumably younger when they began to reproduce. Now, that in itself is an interesting finding. But if you are starting to think like an evolutionary biologist now, you might come up with a way to extend this experiment even further. You've established that the guppies lower down in the stream, where there are more predators ready to eat them, start reproducing at younger ages than the guppies way up in the headwaters of streams that are safer. And you might start thinking to yourself, suppose we move these guppies around, transpose them. Suppose we took the small, young producing guppies and put them in the headwaters of the streams. And suppose we took the larger, later reproducing guppies and put them down in the lower reaches of the stream. Our theory would predict that the small guppies we moved up to the headwaters would grow bigger and older before they reproduce, and the big guppies that we moved farther down the stream would either be eaten or would evolve to start reproducing earlier. That's what you would think if you were a smart evolutionary biologist. Here's what here's what Resnick wrote. When guppies were transplanted from a high predation site to a previously guppy-free low predation site, they evolved a later age at maturity and a lower rate of investment of resources into making babies relative to the guppies from the control site. Likewise, when predators were introduced, guppies evolved earlier stages of maturity. So, here's a thing where we're not talking about the past, we're not talking about fossils, we're talking about changes in behavior of life cycles, and we are predicting several kinds of changes if we change the environment of the guppies. And in fact, the guppy behavior changes exactly as evolutionary theory predicts. Third example. This is Tiktaalik, which is a Native American word. It's the people who used to be called Eskimos. I forget what they're called now, but at any rate, it's their language. This is from a fellow named Neil Shubin. He's a paleontologist and an anatomist at the University of Chicago. Now remember that one of the things that creationists complain about is that there are few transitional fossils actually discovered. Until 2004, they complained, among other things, that no transitional fossil had been discovered between fish and reptiles and amphibians. That is, no transitional fossil had been discovered between fish and land animals. Creationists used this lack of transitional fossils as part of their attack on Darwin's theory. For example, Philip Johnson in Darwin on Trial makes this attack in pages 76 and 77. However, the theory of natural selection says that such a transitional creature must have existed, and Shubin decided to look for it. According to the paleontology record, in rocks of about 385 million years ago, there are only fish fossils. In rocks of about 365 million years ago, there are fossils of reptiles and amphibians. Therefore, Shubin and his team looked for a place on Earth where the rocks were about 375 million years old. They looked all over the globe and looked through geology books, and they found that in Ellesmere Island, which is an island in the far north of Canada, a lot closer to the North Pole than we are now. It's off the west coast of Greenland. Ellesmere Island had rocks that were 375 million years old. So Shubin got a big grant from somewhere and took his team up to Ellesmere Island in the summer. Incidentally, they took rifles with them because there were polar bears up there. After, I think six summer expeditions to Ellesmere Island. In 2004, Shubin's team discovered a fossil which they named Tiktaalik, which is a transitional creature between fish and reptiles. I'm reading from his book on the subject. Fish and land-living animals differ in many respects. Fish have conical heads, whereas the earliest land-living animals have almost crocodile-like heads, flat, with the eyes on top. Fish do not have necks. Their shoulders are attached to their heads by a series of bony plates. Early land-living animals, like all their descendants, do have necks, meaning their heads can bend independently of their shoulders. There are other big differences. Fish have fins, whereas land-living animals have limbs with fingers, toes, wrists, and ankles. But our new creature, this creature we discovered, broke down the distinctions between these two different kinds of animals. Like a fish, it has fins with webbing. But like early land-living animals, it has a flat head and neck. And when we look inside the fin, we see bones that correspond to the upper arm, the forearm, even parts of the wrist. The joints are there too. This is a fish with shoulder, elbow, and wrist joints, unquote. So, the first important point is we now have found the transitional organism between fish and reptiles, or fish and land-dwelling animals. The second point, which is even more important to this lecture, is we didn't just stumble upon this fossil. We predicted exactly where it would be with reference to evolutionary theory. So once again, if my theory is true, what else must be true? Let's go see if that other thing is true. Once again, here's another example. Now this is one that has to do with modern medicine and is ongoing at the moment. During the 1970s, there was an evolutionary theorist named Robert Trivers, who was at Rutgers University, who reasoned that parents and children must have a permanent conflict. That is, he says, natural selection should favor parents who can successfully raise the most offspring. And for that strategy to work, they cannot put too many resources into any one child. But it's in the interest of each individual child to extract the maximum quantity of resources from each parent. Therefore, children always want more resources than parents want to give, which sets up a conflict. Well, these ideas about these natural conflicts within the family percolated through the literature. During the 1980s, there's another evolutionary biologist named David Haig, who was at Harvard. He reasoned that this conflict would even show up in the womb. A fetus, as I'm quoting, does not sit passively in its mother's womb and wait to be fed. Its placenta sprouts blood vessels that invade its mother's tissues to extract nutrients. Meanwhile, Dr. Haig argued, natural selection should favor mothers who could restrain these incursions and managed to have several surviving offspring carrying their genes. Haig envisioned pregnancy as a tug-of-war. Each side pulls hard, and yet a flag tied to the middle of the rope barely moves. In a 1993 paper, Dr. Haig first predicted that many complications of pregnancy would turn out to be produced by this conflict. Now, one of the most common complications of pregnancy is preeclampsia, in which women experience dangerously high blood pressure late in pregnancy. If you watched the British television series Downton Abbey, you know that the third daughter, I can't remember her name, the first daughter is Lady Mary and the second daughter is Lady Edith, I can't remember who anyway, she died in childbirth essentially from preeclampsia. So this is in fact a serious problem especially if you're a pregnant woman. Dr. Haig proposed that preeclampsia was just an extreme form of a strategy used by all fetuses. The fetuses somehow raised the blood pressure of their mothers so as to drive more blood into the relatively low pressure placenta. So now we come to the prediction derived from the theory. Dr. Haig predicted that preeclampsia would be associated with some substance that fetuses injected into their mother's bloodstream. Preeclampsia happened when fetuses injected too much of the stuff, perhaps if they were having trouble getting enough nourishment. Testing Dr. Haig's prediction, medical researchers discovered that there was a protein which they designated, and here it's written down, SFLTL. It's a much longer name, of course, but SFLTL. Protein which fetuses injected into the mother's body to raise the mother's blood pressure. Preeclampsia is caused by too much SFLTL. So researchers are now working on a way to treat preeclampsia by lowering the amount of SFLTL the fetus injects into the mother. So here we have a great advance in how modern medicine treats pregnant women. A great advance which is based on a prediction derived from evolutionary theory. Next example. There's a group of people who live in Indonesia, Malaya, and the Philippines. They are known as the Bajau, B-A-J-A-U. They live all their lives either on or underwater. They live in houseboats and houses on stilts in coastal waters. Traditionally, they made a living as divers, spearfishing or harvesting shellfish. They can hold their breath for many minutes. They have been observed walking on the seafloor in 200 feet of water. In 2015, Melissa Ilardo, a graduate student in genetics at the University of Copenhagen, began to wonder about whether such abilities might be an evolved adaptation. In other words, she used theory of social biology. Better divers were more successful at having children. Therefore, genes that enabled better diving spread through the population. If my theory is true. So, when she learned that when humans or any mammal dive, their spleen contracts, which squirts extra oxygen-rich blood cells into the circulation system. She predicted that the Bajau would have unusually large spleens to supply an unusually large number of red blood cells. She went there, got a grant of course, tested them, and in fact, the Bajau people have unusually large spleens. However, there was another possibility. Suppose the enlarged spleens were the result of the deep diving, rather than permitting the deep diving. That's a logical possibility. Exercise makes muscles bigger. So, having found that they had unusually large spleens, she couldn't stop there. She had to make another prediction. That the non-diving members of the Bajau, that is, the people who lived on land because they were teachers or shopkeepers, would also have large spleens. She tested them, and they did. She then made a third prediction. She predicted that the Bajau would have a genetic mutation that's not present in other people. She did genetics tests, and she discovered that the Bajau had a mutant gene called PDE10A, which further tests established leads to enlarged spleens. Now this is really cool because it's not just a prediction, it's a chain of predictions derived from the same theory. So, her theory is deep diving is risky. Divers who are able to stay down longer live longer. Divers who have this mutant gene have bigger spleens. This produces more red blood cells, which enables them to deep dive. So the divers with the mutations live longer, therefore they have more children, and therefore the genetic mutation spreads through the whole population. Once again, a series, a chain of predictions derived from evolutionary theory. Okay, there's 5 examples of predictions of things that we didn't know before the predictions were made, that we know now, that were derived directly from evolutionary theory. What about intelligent design? ID people sometimes claim that they've tested their theory, but none of their theories satisfy the requirements of science. We don't have any medical tests. We don't know anything about insects that we didn't know before. They posit supernatural, unobservable, and unmeasurable forces. As a result, they have no replicable tests. In fact, they have no tests at all. Instead of making predictions and running tests, what ID people do is they complain, they write essays complaining about the way science goes. And they demand that they be allowed to bring in supernatural, unmeasurable concepts. Here's an article from the New York Times. It's getting a little old now, but still. The Templeton Foundation, a major supporter of projects seeking to reconcile science and religion, says that after providing grants for conferences and courses to debate intelligent design, they asked proponents to submit proposals for actual research. They never came in, said Charles Harper, Senior Vice President of the Templeton Foundation. From the point of view of rigor and intellectual seriousness, the intelligent design people don't come out very well in our world of scientific review. So, there are no examples of intelligent design predictions that have actually produced any new knowledge. Having said that, let's talk about a return to the question of whether this is an unnecessary conflict. In these discussions, in these essays and books you're reading, there is often either the explicit statement or some sort of implied statement that there's only 2 choices. You must pick science or you must pick religion. That is a false choice. There are many famous scientists who are religious, and there are many religious people who embrace the theory of evolution. So, remember, only people who believe that Genesis is a literal history of the world have trouble with the theory of evolution. People who accept the stories in Genesis as useful moral parables or something along those lines can be religious and have no problem with the theory of evolution. Take, for example, talk about famous scientists, Francis Collins. Collins is a very distinguished biologist. He was director of the Human Genome Project during the 1990s. He's also an evangelical Christian. Here's some quotes from Collins' book. I would like to suggest that science should not be denied by the believer. It should be embraced. The elegance behind life's complexity is indeed reason for awe and for belief in God, but not in the simple, straightforward way that many found so compelling before Darwin came along. Science can be a form of worship, unquote. So if you look at things from Francis Collins' point of view, the whole conflict, alleged conflict, between the theory of evolution and religion is unnecessary. You can be religious and you can be scientific, and there's no point in making a big fight about it. Of course, people do make a big fight about it, otherwise I would not be teaching this class and you would not be taking it. But it's pretty much over now. Okay, that's it.